Fantastic to see the wonderful range of videos that have been made for researchED Durrington during the course of the day, so I hope that I'm not too late in joining in. I have become increasingly concerned really about a gap in the discourse about research-informed and evidence-informed practice in teaching. Really great stuff going on in terms of pedagogy, in terms of curriculum development and so on and so forth, but it strikes me that there's always been a bit of a gap when it comes to talking about pastoral issues and pastoral matters. So that's what I'd like to speak to you about today. We're currently in unprecedented times and everybody is eagerly looking at developing new ways of teaching students when they're not face to face with them. Remote teaching, using a range of strategies, whether you're using Teams, whether you're using YouTube, whether you're using Loom, and so on and so forth. But my question is, how does our pastoral responsibility for our students fit in this new landscape? So my talk today is the 3 C's of remote pastoral care, and they are contact, congregation, and curriculum. So let's start by thinking around ideas of contact. Clearly, we need to be thinking about our vulnerable children. We have the official definition of vulnerable children, of course, and there will be children that we know about. There will be children that are known to us. And inevitably, we have our responsibilities to them. We need to be making sure that we are in regular contact with the families, with home, with the children themselves. That may be through telephone conversations. It may well be that some people are doing home visits. But what about the children who aren't identified to us? Children who don't have specific diagnoses as yet. Children maybe who have recently been just about to maybe speak to somebody, to confide in somebody. Of course, what we've done by closing schools for the majority of students is we've closed down a huge network for students when they may be facing real well-being dilemmas and mental health issues. We've taken away peer support networks, and of course we've taken away adult networks. So it's really important that during this lockdown, during this time when children are going to be at home, that we maintain contact not only with our identified vulnerable children, but with all of our students, giving them an opportunity to realise that we haven't forgotten them, that they haven't been abandoned by their school. It's really important to keep that contact. And this is because we know that separation from peers and separation from support networks, separation from adults in school can actually bring about a sense of isolation. And I'm a secondary school teacher, so I'm thinking particularly from the point of view of secondary school age children, adolescents, at a time when a lot of adolescents might well be choosing to isolate. It's precisely the time when actually they need to be around others, when they need social support networks. We've just taken them away. And I will put in a final slide here some references. There's some interesting work that's been happening with regards to isolation in adolescents and how vulnerable adolescents in particular are to, well, we know that they're vulnerable to mental health issues. It is around that time of adolescence when mental health issues often first emerge, around the age of 12, 13, around about that age where we first start to notice issues around mental health. And what we've done here in the UK, of course, at the moment, is we have taken them out of the school environment and told them to stay home. Now, it may well be that they have very supportive home networks, that their family are on the ball, and so on and so forth, but very often adolescents, the last people that they want to speak to about how they're feeling is their parents or their siblings or other family members. They're too close often. There's been some particularly interesting work. Obviously we're in unprecedented times at the moment. We've not been in a situation like this. So there isn't a wealth of research material into how this kind of event might affect people in the long run, but there are similarities with other issues. And there's a particular paper by Teasdale, 2013, which looked at the mid and long-term effects of Hurricane Katrina, and a significant number of young people experienced depression, PTSD and other mental ill health conditions within 12 months of that event. Part of it obviously was because it was a traumatic experience, but a lot of it also was about that sense of isolation and a lack of a sense of belonging. They had an increased sense of anomie. Now, where we perhaps can also get some ideas from is in the higher education sector, because higher education perhaps have been a bit of ahead of the curve really in terms of remote learning and online learning, and there is a wealth of research into students at higher education level. And it's really interesting that quite a lot of students, there's quite a high dropout rate of students on online courses at higher education level. And one of the reasons that's cited for that dropout rate is because there is a lack of a sense of belonging, that students do feel isolated. Because there are students who have chosen to do those courses. Our students are in situations where they wouldn't have chosen necessarily to attend school anyway, but they certainly wouldn't have chosen by in most cases to attend online courses. And so what might be the dropout rate amongst our students? How can we be sure that they are engaging with the material that we're sending them for academic purposes, but also how can we ensure that they are engaged in acts of well-being? How can we be sure that they are looking after themselves? And so points of contact are really going to be incredibly important in this coming term after the Easter break, heading up to the summer, and maybe even beyond, because we don't know when this is going to be over and when we're going to be back in school. Now, a lot of the work that I've seen happening, a lot of resources that are being shared via Twitter and so on and so forth, people are talking about doing live lessons, people are talking about videoing lessons using technology like this, people are talking about using things like Google Classroom, Microsoft Teams, and that's really fantastic. But not all of our children are necessarily going to have access to those. We run the risk, I think, if we assume that children at home have access to computers, if they have access to broadband, and it may well be that there's a computer in the house, but it might be that there's 2 or 3 or 4 siblings all wanting access to that one device. It may well be that they have access to smartphone technology, iPad and other tablets, but we can't assume that they do. And if we want to be making contact with our students, if we want to be keeping in touch with them, just to check in, just to check that they're okay, make sure that they're okay, we can't necessarily rely on the fact that they might be always checking on their emails, because they simply might not. So one of the questions that you need to be asking yourselves as school leaders, as pastoral leaders, is how can you make sure that you are in regular contact with your known vulnerable students, but also all of your students? What about those students who might not be on your radar as vulnerable? Perhaps we need to start thinking about all of our students as being potentially vulnerable, because I genuinely think they are. So contact with these children is going to be incredibly important, let alone in families where contact is difficult anyway. A phone call may well be ideal. Home visit may be necessary. But contact, not only with the children, with their families, but with other support services as well. And we know that people like CAMS, social services, they're going to be really stretched. But we need to be doing our utmost to keep in touch with our students. One of the things that I increasingly thinking about is that our school communities really act in ways like church congregations. And it's interesting that the whole idea of pastoral care really has its roots in the church. When I did a Google search earlier on today for pastoral care coronavirus, the vast majority of results that came up were from different church groups giving advice to church leaders about how they can keep in touch with their parishioners in this particular unusual time that we face. And it may well be useful for schools to think in terms of having congregations. Within our research-informed and evidence-informed practice, we're often given the analogy of medicine, that we want teaching, that we want education to be a little bit more like medicine. And that has its use up to a point. But I also think that the analogy with church is just as helpful. I know that people are going to find that uncomfortable, and that as soon as people mention congregations and churches and so on and so forth, that you're going to think that I'm automatically talking about matters of faith and matters of worship, and I'm really not. Congregation, community, synonymous perhaps in this talk. But one of the interesting things that comes out of this, I think, is the role of a chaplain. Now, I've put that in inverted commas because you don't necessarily have to have an appointed school chaplain. It's really interesting though when you look at the Church of England, for example, and their criteria of what a school chaplain does. And it's a pastoral role. It's not too dissimilar to what people like heads of year, heads of house, mentors, and so on and so forth in schools are doing. But I think that at this time in particular, whilst you are thinking about keeping your students busy and active and providing lots of work for them to do, it's really important that you identify somebody on your staff who's going to act in role as a kind of chaplain. And this is somebody who's going to be thinking about the welfare of the students beyond their academic progress. Quite a lot of the talk that's been happening in the media, of course, since the announcement that schools were going to close was all around how are Year 11 and Year 13 going to gain qualifications that will enable them to, for example, go to university. That's an understandable bit of the discourse, of course. It's understandable that people are going to be having those concerns. But what about the emotional well-being of students in our Year 11 and our Year 13? What are we doing to help them to get through this really weird time? Not just in Year 11 and Year 13, but in all of the other year groups too. What are we putting in place? What emotional support are we providing for them? Because it's weird for us. Imagine how weird it is when you're 15, 13, 11, 6. What are we doing as schools, as school leaders, as pastoral leaders, to make sure that our congregation are not so worried that they are incapable of looking beyond the immediate future? How do we give them a sense of things are going to be okay, and how are we going to help them when perhaps things aren't okay? Because we are all going to know people who are going to suffer from this coronavirus. It's a matter of fact that we are going to know people who are going to not survive. How are we going to help our students through this weird, strange and frightening time? So we've got to look beyond the academic. We've got to look beyond helping students to come to terms with the fact that they're not going to have any exams this year, and what that's also going to mean for kids in Year 12 and Year 10 with their exams next year. Those are important considerations, but there are other important considerations that we need to think about too. So thinking about our school community as a congregation with a chaplain. And I mentioned that when you Google the phrase pastoral care coronavirus, it's all churches that come up as the results, and it's really interesting to look at those and to see the kind of advice that they are giving to their religious leaders to help in this weird time. And one of the things that's coming out of that is the importance of having a chaplain who will listen, to the concerns of their parishioners, who will listen when people need to speak. And I think this is really important for us, because a lot of us are thinking about the stuff that we are giving out, the videos of our lessons that we're going to be making, the resources that we're going to be producing and putting out. And we're also going to be thinking about how we're going to be giving feedback on any work that the students produce. What's the most effective way of doing that? But how we opened up the lines of communication so that students can get in touch with us, so that they can raise flags with us, so that they can ask us questions, not just academic ones, but perhaps slightly broader ones. What are those channels of communication that we've created for them, with us and with each other? And one of the other things that I think that this analogy with congregational thinking might be, is to be thinking about what values and messages we want to be continuing to give our students whilst they're not in school. I'm not entirely convinced that we do a great job in school of thinking really clearly about our pastoral messages. I think sometimes they are confused and confusing. Sometimes I don't think that we apply the same kind of joined up thinking to our pastoral curriculum as we do to our academic curriculum. And now is a really good time to be thinking about what are those key messages that we want to be sending to our students. What are the golden threads that we want to be sending them? And that brings us on to thinking about matters of curriculum. So I'm a real proponent of hard thinking about curriculum, and I am an advocate of knowledge-rich curriculums. I know there's all those sorts of questions about whose knowledge, what knowledge, and those are important questions. But often what gets missed out from that discourse is the pastoral knowledge, the pastoral curriculum. What do we want our children to learn pastorally? And often things like PSHE and citizenship and character education, some people take them very seriously, not everybody does. They're often regarded as being soft, or they're regarded as bolt-ons. Most of us don't really seem to enjoy planning PSHE lessons, for example. They're something that we kind of have to do, not really something that we want to do. But it's really important that we think really clearly about what our PSHE, our citizenship, our relationships and sex education messages and all of those sorts of things. We need to be thinking really carefully about what they are, especially now when we are thinking about what kind of work are we going to be sending home for students. Don't neglect the personal development aspect of your curriculum. Don't just prioritise the subject-specific academic stuff. You need to be making sure that your curriculum that you're getting the kids to engage with by remote learning is enriched with the pastoral and the personal development just as much as it is with the academic. One of the things that is of a bit of a concern for me, and it kind of comes across all of this really, is that one of the obvious answers to the issue around contact and around building communities when we are working remotely and delivering curriculum is, the use of technology. And we are going to be encouraging students to engage in platforms which are essentially social media platforms, like Microsoft Teams, for example. And yet, these are the very technologies and the very platforms that we are constantly alerting students to for the dangers that are involved in those applications. And whilst we are constructing methods of delivering teaching and learning via remote mechanisms, let's not forget those important messages as well about staying safe online because it's quite likely our students are going to be engaging with social media even more whilst they're not in school than they do when they're at school. And there's a very good chance that they're going to be uploading TikTok videos and sharing comments about their videos and making content and sharing their comments about that content. But it's going to be even harder for us to keep a track of those kinds of conversations. It's going to be even harder for students to alert us to when they are being on the receiving end of unpleasantness. Bear that in mind too, and make sure that your students have the mechanisms to alert you to any problems that they are experiencing through online media. There is one more thing that's really important to flag up when we're talking about remote pastoral care. So really, it's not the 3 C's of remote pastoral care. That's wrong. We need to be thinking about the 4 C's of remote pastoral care, because we've got to be thinking about our colleagues too. And they're going to be finding it hard. And as pastoral leaders, we need to be thinking about our colleagues just as much perhaps as we do about our children. Because if we get that wrong, then we're not helping the kids either. Thank you for listening. Please do tweet me any questions that you've got. Here is a list of the references, and if you want that DMing to you or whatever, I'm happy to send that to you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Enjoy your Easter break, and enjoy all your clever plannings for what you do with the kids after